It's time to feel what you've been bottling up. Life in rural America isn't easy. The long hours, the constant pressures, the demands of the land, livestock, and family, it all takes a toll. We're tough and we've got grit, but somewhere along the way, toughness started meaning bottling up emotions and powering through. But here's the truth. That strategy, it's not working and it's poisoning us. Maybe you've noticed and maybe you haven't, but the numbers don't lie. We're breaking down and it's showing up in our bodies, our relationships, and in the rising suicide rates in agriculture. You don't have to carry any of it alone. There's another way. If you're ready to stop being weighed down and start moving forward, my one-on-one good movement guidance is now open. Visit the link in the show notes to learn more and see if one-on-one guidance could be for you.
I'll carry you, you carry me, we'll help each other through it. Come on and see, good movement draws good movement.
Welcome to Good Movement Draws Good Movement, the podcast where farmers, ranchers, and rural folks can grow relationally through awareness, understanding, and effective communication. Hey, it's T. I'm your host, and I, along with my guests, will be covering topics related to drawing good movement. Things like self and social awareness, brain science, positive psychology, extending grace, and so much more. We'll share tools that can help you understand why you are the way you are, why others are the way they are, and how you can use that to step out of self-told lies with grace and compassion to draw good movement in conversations, relationships, and life in rural America. Let's go draw good movement. Welcome back to the Good Movement Draws Good Movement podcast. I am very excited for today's guest. Warwick Schiller is someone that Tom and I have looked up to for a good while, whether he knew it or not. He didn't. Warwick focuses on relationship-based horse training. Relationship before horsemanship is about helping the horse regulate their nervous system through connection before working on shaping their behaviors. He shares his work in his online video library at clinics and horse expos around the world, as well as on his YouTube channel where he has amassed over 33 million views. He also hosts the Journey On podcast, which in 2023 was in the top 1% of all podcasts worldwide, with over 3 million downloads. He is also the author of The Principles of Training, which in addition to being an Amazon best-selling book in the equine category, is also required reading in our household. So Tom read your book and he's like, everyone in the family needs to read this book. So I read your book and I'm like, yeah, dang right, everyone in the family needs to read this book. So our 14-year-old son is currently reading your book, The Principles of Training.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. It's not really a horse training book, but, thinly disguised helping humanity as horse training,
Yeah, you're exactly right. When I'm reading it, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so not about training. I mean, sure, it's the principles of training and they work for training your horse, but this is so much more than that. So I want to take a minute to just say thank you for being here with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. You just said in your intro there that I do presented horse expos around the world, and we just got back last night from Australia. So I was at a horse expo, so forgive me for a little bit jet lagged. I might be a bit spacey this morning.
No problem. I really appreciate you coming on. And in your email, when you're like, I'm going to Australia and then I'll be back on the 19th, I was like, kind of surprised when you scheduled for today, but I'm so glad that you're here. So I just gave the formal intro, but would you take a minute and tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Well, there isn't that much more to say, really. That's what I'm up to these days. And, I could give you my whole life story, but all the things would be leading to what I'm doing now. So there's, you don't need to fill in the blanks about how I got here. But now that I'm here, this is what interests me these days.
So I'm glad that you put it that way because it leads me right into my next question perfectly. How did you first come to focus on relationship before horsemanship? Like, was there a specific moment or a horse that shifted your perspective to prioritize the connection over the behavior shaping?
Yeah, most certainly. my wife bought a rein. So I was heavily involved in the reining for quite a long time. That was what I was, that's what I was passionate about, was training reining horses. And I think what really got me into the whole horsemanship thing was just trying to find out better ways to get inside a horse's mind to do the reining, Then as the years went on, that kind of fell away a bit, and I was more interested in just getting along with horses better. But my wife bought a horse years ago, and it was a very talented reining horse, but had some little issues that I thought when we bought him, I thought, well, I can solve those. Like they're pretty simple. And I couldn't. And yeah, it took me quite a while to figure out. I tried this, I tried that, I tried this, I tried that. And it took me a while to figure out that, I'm not able to reach him with the things that I currently know. And it wasn't like they were behavioral issues. It was more as like he held this internal tension. He did all the things, but he did them all with a slight internal tension that kind of got in the way of him being absolutely spectacular. And yeah, I couldn't train this internal tension out of him. And he kind of made me step away from trying to make him any different and start to look at things outside I was always kind of an outside the box kind of a guy anyway. And in that whole horse training world, I was a bit outside the box, but I didn't realize that there were boxes outside the boxes. And I was drawn to read articles by people I wouldn't have been drawn to read articles by previously, people that I used to put in what I used to term as crazy cat lady land sort of thing, So I was looking into different things, and then I was doing a lot of clinics, and I was lucky enough to have a lot of horses to experiment with. And people would come I used to get quite a crowd of spectators at the clinics. And I started saying, I know you're all here. You want to see the guy you've seen on YouTube or whatever. I said, I'm no longer that guy. I don't know who I am actually, but if you bear with me, I'm going to try some things with these horses today that I'm drawn to start working with these days. But I had no idea what I was doing at the time. I mean, this is after I knew what I was doing, the whole saying, it's what's important is what you learn after you know it all. It was kind of like that. And I was learning stuff pretty much in public because I was lucky. Like I said, I got to do lots of clinics. So every weekend I had 12 different horses to experiment with. And so that was really helpful. But probably the most impactful one was I was doing a clinic in Texas, and it was a 3-day clinic. I normally do 2-day clinics, so I don't even know why it was a 3-day clinic, but there was a girl there with a Mustang, and he has a random bolting issue. They can't figure out why. It's not the same thing that causes him to bolt. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. I don't even recall this horse the first day of the clinic. We did some groundwork, I believe, but the second day of the clinic, the owner she was just going to walk down his side and ask him to step over behind. She's going to ask him to disengage behind. And she went to do it, and he started to block her out with his head. He would turn his head and block her out. And she said, hey, I've got a problem over here. He's blocking me out. And so I went over and said, oh, let me try. And a lot of times they'll do that when someone goes to walk down beside him to ask him to step over behind, because the person's body language tells them that's what I'm going to do. So they're kind of preempting you. So I thought it might have been her body language, like getting ahead of herself. But it wasn't that. I went to step from in front of him. He's facing me. I went to step down his near side, and he just turned his head and blocked me. And in the past, I probably would have just reached under his jaw with my hand and just moved his head over and kept going down that side. But with this horse, when he turned his head and blocked me out, I stepped back to where I was. And I kind of was saying, I see you don't like that. I'm not sure why you don't like that, but apparently that concerns you. And so I stepped back to the front, and I kind of waited for him to show me some sign of being a little more relaxed. It wasn't a big thing like a lick and a chew, but maybe his eyes had stopped blinking. Maybe I waited for him to start blinking, or his ears had been fixated and I waited for them to move. Something like that. And then I tried it again, blocked me out. And so I kept just going back and forth with this little dance, so to speak. And I was telling the owner while this was going on, I said, if he lets me down there, I think what's happened here is he's 9 years old. He's been out of the wild for 6 years. He's been ridden for 6 years, and you're still working on disengaging his hind end. I think that's a basic thing. I think he's sick of being asked to do that thing over and over. And if I can get down his side, I'll show you what I mean. So after 5 or 10 minutes of this back and forth in front of him, he lets me down beside him. And I thought, well, before I ask him to step over behind, I'm just going to put my hand on his wither. I'm not sure why I was going to do that. I think he's been ridden for 6 years. You could obviously touch him. But as I went to put my hand on his wither, his head raised like half an inch. he just stiffened up a slight little bit and his eyes stopped blinking. And so I took my hand away and I stood there until he relaxed again. Then I did it again. And eventually after 5 or 10 minutes, I can now put my hand on his wither without him tensing up slightly. And so then I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to disengage him. So I asked him to step over behind, which he does perfectly. And I said, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk back to the front. And if he lets me come down the side, I'm going to disengage him again. And I'm going to do this over and over. And what'll happen after 5 or 6 times, he's probably going to go, nah, enough of that stuff. Because I thought that's what was going on. So I went to the front of him. I go to walk down beside him. He lets me. I ask him to step over behind. He does it perfectly. I go back to the front. He lets me back down his side again. I asked him to step over. Go back to the front. And I did it 10 or 12 times. I couldn't break it. I couldn't get him to say no. And so I said to her, I have no idea why he was blocking us out, because he seems well trained to do the thing and he seems quite happy to do the thing. So really, I don't know what happened there. But anyway, it's not broken anymore. Here you go. And I hand her the horse. And she said, what do you want me to do with him? And I said, just hang with him. You know, there's nothing to do right now. We've just been through something. Just hang with him and I'll help somebody else. So I'm helping somebody else in the clinic. And about 10 minutes later, I hear this collective from everybody in the crowd. And this horse buckled at the knees and just flopped to his belly, like flopped down his belly, lay on his side, had a big roll, jumped up, shook, and then just basically collapsed, like buckled at the knees, went down on his belly, and his head was perpendicular to the ground, and he was snoring little dust clouds in the dirt, you know. And I said to her, is that normal? Because, you know, as you know, working with animals and livestock, whatever, if it's normal behavior, it's not a big deal. But if it's not normal, and I said, is that normal? And she said, I've seen him lay down once in the last 6 years. And when he saw me on the horizon, he jumped up. He never lays down. I'm like, well, that's interesting. And that was about probably 10 o'clock in the morning, and he slept till lunchtime. At the time, I would have 2 groups in my clinics, and she was in the morning group, and we actually had to wake him up to get him out of the arena. So that's pretty interesting. A horse that doesn't normally sleep, hasn't seen lay down in 6 years, lays down, sleeps for 2 hours, and there's horses riding around, there's microphones, there's a lot of commotion. So the next morning when she came in for the last day of the clinic, she said, what would you like me to do? And I said, just hang with him and see what happens. She stands there. 20 minutes later, he buckles at the knees, down he goes, lays flat on his side and sleeps for 4 hours. Doesn't move a muscle. Ever seen a horse sleep for 4 hours? Doesn't move a muscle for 4 hours. And when I came home from that clinic, I knew that there'd been a huge change in that horse. And I wasn't quite sure why, but I knew something that I did facilitated it. And so I kind of looked up sleeping habits of horses on the internet. And, you know, I knew horses can sleep standing up with that locked stay mechanism, or they can sleep laying down. What I didn't know was that in order for a horse to get the deep restorative REM sleep that we all need, they have to lay prone. And in order to lay prone, they have to feel safe. And that's when it hit me. I made him feel safe. And how I made him feel safe was communicating my awareness of little things. Like when he turned his head, instead of me not even noticing it and walking around his head because I have an agenda, I want to disengage you, I recognized it and I stepped back. And I must have intuitively known what I was doing, but I didn't cognitively know what I was doing at the time. And since then, I've been on this bit of an experiment to see how much can I get done with a horse just by communicating my awareness of their awareness. And it's been quite an experiment messing with. And that's where the whole relationship before horsemanship thing comes in is, you know, horses in a herd, I think they're stock in trade. The thing that they get out of being with the herd is the awareness of other herd members. That, you know, the more herd members, the more sets of eyes, the less awareness I have to have of everything. And I can kind of relax sort of thing. And so so your question was there a horse that, yes, there was the one initially of my wife's, but probably that Mustang at that clinic in Texas was the next one that really got me thinking about things. And I didn't know it at the time, but he never bolted again.
It's fascinating.
He only just passed away about 3 months ago. But it had been about 5 or 6 years since that clinic, and he had not bolted once since. So, you know, think about that. We solved a random bolting issue, not by training and not by asking. And I always say that horse was the first horse I ever, let's call, helped, where I didn't ask anything of him.
You validated him.
Yes. I didn't tell, I listened.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that was a big shift. Yeah.
Yeah. I go around and talk to different groups of cattlemen and women, and we talk about validation. and how important it is in our human to human interactions. And I have to come back and relate it back to how we validate our cattle, specifically our cattle in those. But I use you as an example when I'm talking about this because we just need to be heard and listened to. And like you've said in your book and your podcasts and your YouTube videos, we need to feel felt. I mean, like that's a great example of that. I'm glad you shared that story with us. So you have mentioned unraveling ourselves. What role do horses play in helping us do that? And how has your own journey of unraveling influenced the way you approach your work, both with horses and people?
Well, I think it actually went the other way. Your question there was how has my unraveling helped how I work with horses? But I think the working with horses started my unraveling. And that first horse I told you about, the one that my wife got, he was very, very obedient, like very well trained, did exactly what he had to do to stay out of trouble, but he was not quite relaxed while he was doing it. And he was very shut down, and he actually led me to understand that I'd spent my life exactly the same way, raised to be a very obedient child, so the things you do them to stay out of trouble. And also, as a male growing up in rural Australia, boys don't cry, boys don't show fear. In my family, we didn't express grief. I remember when I was about 12 years old, I think, a friend of mine, his dad was cutting down a tree and the tree fell on him and killed him. And I remember I was sitting on the foot of mum and dad's bed. I don't know what I was doing in their bedroom, but I was sitting on the foot of mum and dad's bed, and his name was Ben, and his name came up as something or other, and I started to cry, and mum's like, no, he's crying, he's dead. And I think that's the way they were raised. You know what I mean? There's no judgment. That's just how it was. And so, you don't actually express emotions. You don't talk about emotions. And I don't think you have emotions on either end of the scale. Like for some reason, my parents didn't like anything loud in the house. So I think if you were laughing too loud or whatever, like go outside. But I was at a horse expo in Madison, Wisconsin a few years ago, presenting there. And most of the time at horse expos, I work with a horse in the arena, but sometimes they'll have like a lecture hall set up and you get to do the talk of your choice. And they always want titles, 3 or 6 months ahead of time. So I have this title that I will give horse expos, and it's called Everything in Life I Learned from Horses. And it's always a little bit different because the next time I do the talk, things have changed or whatever. But this was probably the first time I did this talk after I'd had some of these experiences. Or maybe it was even before, I don't even think I told the Mustang story. So there were some other things that happened before the Mustang, but I'm in a room full of, there's probably 100, 200 people in this room. And I talked for an hour and a half, and I told them some stuff that I probably had never told anybody before. Maybe not even admitted to myself. And I'm not talking, intimate stuff. And I'm talking relationships with horses or how I felt about things or whatever. And so when I went back to my booth after that, I walked past a booth of a lady named Barbara Schulte, who's a big-time cutting horse trainer. She's in the Cowgirl Hall of Fame, but she's also quite a mental coach. And I walked past Barb's booth and she said, how did it go? And I said, oh, Barb, I feel like I've been run over by a truck. And she's like, why? I said, I told those people some stuff I may not have even told myself before. She says, Brené Brown says vulnerability is the ultimate in badassery. I'm like, who? And she said, Brené Brown, you should look her up. So I came home and I looked up this Brené Brown. I got some audio books that I'd listened to, on the noise cancelling headphones when I was on the tractor or whatever. And one day I heard this thing that she said, you cannot selectively suppress emotions. If you suppress the lower emotions, you automatically suppress the higher ones. And I thought, well, I know my lower emotions are suppressed, the fear, all that sort of stuff. I've never thought, could I experience more joy or happiness or some of that stuff in life? So that led me to seek out a therapist and go and see a therapist. And, it's like all the stuff I learned in therapy is like, I know this with horses. I just don't know it with people sort of thing. So it really was the horses that really shaped, kind of got me aware of how I'd been showing up in the world. And so that's basically how all that happened.
Yeah, you can't suppress one without suppressing them all. That was a mind-blowing discovery for myself not all that long ago. But since I've discovered it, the more joy that I feel has been real fun.
Yeah, and you mentioned before that I have a podcast, and on my podcast, I interview all sorts of really, really interesting people. And what I try to do, it's called the Journey On podcast. So it's about their journey. I don't spend a lot of time, what do you do now? And it's not 2 hours of what do you do now, even though most of them, the thing they do now deserves at least a 2-hour podcast. They're doing some amazing stuff in the world. But basically, the podcast is really about people who are doing amazing stuff in the world and how they unraveled the societal and cultural conditioning that they were raised with. And the thing that listeners seem to get out of the podcast is either one, inspiration, or two, validation. So the inspiration is, oh, I could be doing more in my life. Or the other one, the validation was, oh, I thought I was the only one who felt that way. Because a lot of times we don't share some of these things with other people. And when you have someone on a podcast who is an amazing human and doing amazing stuff in the world, and they share some sort of vulnerability that you've never heard anybody else share before, it really validates people. But yeah, that's what the podcast is about, is we all grow up and we are culturally and societally conditioned to view the world a certain way. And when you start to unravel that, it's life-changing, because what I like to do these days, I know you didn't ask this question, it might be a question you're going to ask, but I'll tell you now. What I really like to do in everything I'm doing, whether it's presenting at a horse expo or it's doing a clinic or having a guest on the podcast, I like to shatter a long-held truth that someone has held all their life, just one of them. So if it's with a horse clinic, I'll give them a different perspective on horses, and I'll kind of, holy cow, I never thought about it like that, but that makes more sense than the way I've been viewing horses. Because usually the results, if we're talking about connection and attunement and stuff, usually when you do that and the horse is completely different, now the person's like, oh, he's only been doing that because I viewed what he was doing in a bad way or whatever, you know what I mean? But if I can shatter someone's one long-held truth through whatever it is I'm doing, it kind of opens the door to go away and start to examine every other one of their truths that they've ever been raised with. And that's not my business. I feel like I'm in the business of helping them shatter one of them and then let them do the rest of it on their own.
You know what that is? Good movement, drawing good movement. Sorry, I had to throw that in there.
Please throw that in there. Yeah.
Actually, one of your podcast guests has been a guest on this podcast, Kaya Twisselman-Burchett.
Ah, yeah. Okay. Yeah. She's from around here where I'm from, but she doesn't live anymore. But her family are big ranchers around here.
Yeah. Kaya was actually, so I started my online venture in blogging. So I just talked about how we raise beef, and I was there as a resource for people who didn't know how we did that, and, shared recipes and ranching and all the things. And Kaya was actually the first person to recognize me in real life. We were at a cattlemen's convention, and she came up to me at one of the little mixer things, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, you're Taryn from Faith, Family, and Beef." And at that time, my husband, Tom, was like, "Oh, you're just playing around on the internet." And after Kaya came up to me and recognized me, he's like, "Okay, it's more than just playing around on the internet."
Did you know who Kaya was at the time?
I did not.
Because it would have been even more impactful if you knew the impact she was making in the world. She's an influencer of sorts. You know what I mean?
This was before her influencing days. She was, she was still influencing, obviously. She worked for the Kentucky Beef Council at the time. And then we became friends, and we've been friends ever since. So kind of a cool little story of how the internet can make lasting connections, I guess.
Yeah. You know what? The internet can be very divisive, or it can be very connecting.
Yeah.
It's like the black wolf and the white wolf, depends on which one you feed.
Yeah. So you focus on helping horses regulate their nervous systems through connection. What signs do you kind of look for in a horse to gauge where they are emotionally and mentally? And then how do those same principles apply to people, or how have you started implementing that with people?
When I do clinics and presentation at horse expos, a lot of times I'll start out somewhere in the beginning of it saying that, in 800 BC, a Chinese philosopher named Lao Tzu said, if you are depressed, you're living in the past. And if you're anxious, you're living in the future. And if you are peaceful, you are living in the present. And I say, so with humans or horses, but let's go with horses. If a horse is standing here and his head is up and his ears are pricked and his eyes are bulging, he's looking at something off in the distance, he's in the future. that thing is not killing me right now, but is it going to? Whereas if a horse has had lots of, so much suboptimal human interactions, a lot of times they can go internal and they're kind of just standing there. And this is what that's horse Sherlock that I talked about before. He was very internal, and that internal way he's being is from the past. So this is depression. He's this way because of past things that's happening. He's not interacting with the world as it's happening right now. He's interacting with the world based on his past experience. And so, with the ones that are quite externally fixated, the ones that are anxious, I try to bring their mind back to their body, try to get their mind back in the same place their feet are. And, a lot of times in horsemanship, the saying was, move the feet to get to the mind. But I actually try not to. Some horses you may have to, but for the most part, I try to get to the mind to get to the feet. And a lot of times that might be just attracting attention with if they're anxious about something. I've kind of got this process, but if, let's say I was standing with a horse on a lead rope, his head was up and his ears are pricked and he's looking at something in the distance, I would look at what he's looking at. So I would mirror him. Okay. And I'd say, my body language say, yes, I see it, but we're going to be fine. What I don't do is try to get his attention back there, because that would be like, the way I explain it to people is, let's say you are somewhere, you're in a bit of a scary environment. And let's say somewhere and there's a snake and you're like, oh my God, there's a snake. And the person next to you is tapping you on the shoulder, say, hey, look at this meme I found on my phone the other day. It's like you are not reading the seriousness of this situation. So that would actually give you less faith in them. If they're afraid of dying and you're trying to say, hey, look over here for a second, it's not the place to do that. But if their mind gets so far from their feet that their feet follow their mind, and they'll walk, and when they get to the end of the lead ropes, so as I feel a little feel on lead ropes, there's a little feel on the side of their head. I've got this little pocket flag I pull out and I'll wave it somewhere, maybe wave it towards their flank. I'm not trying to drive them anywhere. I'm trying to attract their attention. And as their thoughts come back down that lead rope, their feet follow. There'll be a moment there where their mind and their body are in the same place at the same time. And so I've done two things. I've got their focus back where their body is, but the instant that focus changes, they stop doing anything. So the second thing I'm doing is communicating my awareness of that change in focus. You've got to have good timing right there. That's kind of a small part of what I do with the anxious ones, but the ones that are in their head, the ones that are kind of in depressed type state, they're pretty much sick of being asked to do anything. So asking them to do anything does not seem to be helpful. So what I'll do with those is I want to be able to communicate my awareness of their change in focus, but I don't want to ask for something because a lot of times they'll just reject that. So what I'll do with those a lot of times is I'll go up and I'll just start to scratch them on the wither. And I'm not scratching them because they like it, because most of these shutdown horses will not even respond when you do it. So I'm doing something that's non-aversive, okay, but it's there. I'll be scratching them on the wither. And if they blink, if they flick an ear, if they look away, they look towards, look up, down, I don't care. Anytime there's any sort of a change in focus, I'll just stop scratching. And then I'll go back to scratching. And usually that change in focus is not because of me. It might be something in the distance they look at, or it might be a rejection of me. When I start scratching, if their eyes turn away from me, like, oh God, this person's touching me, I'll stop right there. You're trying to communicate your awareness of the subtlest things. And what'll happen a lot of times, at a clinic, if there's one like that, I'll go to do this and the people say, oh, he doesn't have an itchy spot. And I'm like, I'm not looking for his itchy spot, but I'll scratch there on the wither. And sometimes within about 10 of these little interactions, when I go to scratch, instead of them ignoring it, you'll see their bottom lip start to maybe kind of twitch. And then I'll stop when that starts to twitch. And then, pretty soon I can scratch them on the wither and they will actually turn their head upside down. They're like, oh my God, that feels so good. So they actually start to let you in a little bit. They start to actually communicate how they feel. But, those are the kind of the two extremes, the anxious, which their mind and their body separated by distance, and the other one, the depressed type state, is where their mind and body are almost separated by time.
So how do you use those principles when you're communicating with other humans?
I don't profess to be much of an expert on the humans, but horses have taught me how to be present with people. And we've just come back from a 4-day horse expo in Australia. So there was that plus the 14-hour flight, plus the layover, plus the hour, all that sort of thing. So I'm a bit spacey today because those horse expos, if someone comes up with a booth and they're talking to me, I am right there with them. There is nothing else happening for that time when I'm interacting with them. And it's not something I used to be able to do. And what's really interesting is I was at a horse expo a few years ago and I was talking to this lady who's a therapist. She's a therapist a lot of times for horse people because a lot of times the problems they're having with their horses are actually internal problems. But I was talking to her and we were having this really deep conversation. And while I was talking to her, I was just maintaining eye contact with her and talking to her. And I said, you know what? I just realized that I didn't used to be able to do this. I couldn't stay, looking into someone's eyes for this long. And I said, and I'm not sure what changed. I said, because when you look into someone's eyes like this and hold their gaze, you're letting them see who you are. And I said, I don't know what's changed, whether the stuff I didn't want them to see has been healed, or there's the possibility that I no longer am worried about letting them see the unhealed in me. I'm not sure which one it is, but it wasn't anything I'd ever considered. It was interesting, that horse expo. I had things kind of flowing through me. Like I'd be in front of a crowd of people speaking and I would say something that I've said before, but I would say it and it would come out on a much deeper level. Like I would understand it on a deeper level in that moment where I hadn't before. And I've never said it that way before. And I just felt like, I don't know, I was like channeling something. I don't know what it was, but that was the same horse expo. And when I was talking to that lady, what I just told you right then that I said, I'd never said it before and I'd never really even considered it before. So the horses have helped me with people. But yeah, thinking about how I would deal with someone who is experiencing anxiety, I would do something to bring them back in their body. And it might be box breathing. It might be 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste, any of those sort of somatic things to get them back in their body. But if a person is shut down, it would be somewhat similar to what I do with the horses, is not asking anything of them, but communicate my awareness of things. I had a lady at a clinic years ago in Texas, and she is a nurse in a juvenile psych ward. And I said, is that like part of a jail? She goes, no, we're after jail. This is a juvenile psych ward. And she'd been to several clinics. She was actually at the one where the Mustang lay down. But the second time that I saw her at a clinic, I said, how's work been, And she said, it's been tough. It's been tough. We've had some kids in there who have been trafficked, some of them from as young as the age of 4. I'm like, oh my God. How are they when they come in? And she said, well, usually they're non-verbal. They won't look at people. They won't talk to people. And I said, so how do you find a starting point with them? And she said, well, they usually have a room to themselves and there's 2 twin beds, one on each side. And a lot of times they'll just lay on the bed and curl up in the fetal position. So what we will do is we'll go in and we'll curl up on the other bed, matching their body language. If they're curled up in the fetal position, we curl up in the fetal position. If they roll over, we roll over. If they sit up, we sit up. And she said, what we're doing is doing that. We're communicating our awareness of at least their body language. And we're also communicating, we don't want something from you. You've had a lot of people want a lot of stuff from you. We don't want anything from you. And she said, that's the thing that kind of opens the doorway to having some sort of communication with them, is mirroring, which, the mirroring tells you are aware of them in all the ways. And the other part of that mirroring is you're not asking anything. And a lot of times horses have never had someone approach them and not ask something of them. You know what I mean? Or I imagine in your business, a lot of people's cows have never had anybody approach them without going to move them somewhere. And as soon as a human shows up, where are we going to go? What are we going to do? Sort of thing,
Yeah, there's a lot of anticipation you talk about anticipation with horses, and there's a lot of anticipation with cattle also. The story you were telling about talking to the therapist and you recognized that you'd never been able to maintain eye contact for that long. I recently had that realization myself. Mine is due to actually experiencing my emotions instead of holding them in. But what I wanted to ask you, was that before or after you were at the clinic and you were telling people things you hadn't even told yourself?
Oh, this was a year ago. So it was years after.
So I'm wondering if it's sort of a similar thing where you started talking about these things and letting the light in or exposing them to light. And then all of a sudden you can maintain eye contact.
Well, it's funny that it was sometime after that, or was it the week after? I actually think it was the week after. So it was that horse expo, and that kind of cracked me a little bit. And then I did a clinic midweek that week, somewhere back east, somewhere cold and nasty. And then the next weekend, I did a clinic, and I did the clinic on the Saturday. Saturday night, we all went out for dinner. And then after dinner, we went around to this guy's house, and we're all kind of hanging out there. And there was a girl there who is a therapist. And funnily enough, she has a great story. She grew up, her family used to host Ray Hunt clinics at their ranch, whatever. I think they ranched and also, had horses, and we're into learning stuff with the horses. And then she started training horses, and she realized that a lot of the troubles people have with horses, it's people problems. So she then went and spent 4 years getting a psychology degree, and is a practicing psychologist. But her plan was eventually to go back to training horses. And she got the 4-year psych degree just so she can help the people with the issues that are stopping them from getting along with their horses. But anyway, she was at this house that night, some people over on the couch talking, me and her and her husband were over at the kitchen bench talking. And she has these big, I don't know what color her eyes are, but she would look at me and ask a very probing question and then just look at me. And I started to glitch out, And so a lot of the questions I didn't answer, but she got me a bit glitchy, And anyway, then she left. And so I went over, I'm sitting on the couch talking to the guy that owned the house and these two girls who were visiting from England, actually. And one of them asked a question of me that really hit me. And then the next one asked a question that hit me, and I wasn't answering. They were just asking me questions. And the next one asked me, and they kind of did 2 rounds of questions. It was the weirdest thing, but suddenly I wasn't like I had tunnel vision, but there was this odd change in my vision. And then the room shifted so the floor went to about 45 degrees. I felt like I was going to slide off the earth. And then it came back flat. And when it came back flat, I lost it. Like I had a breakdown. They triggered something in me that made me realize half the stuff you talk is shit. Like you don't know what you're talking about. You just pretend you know what you're talking about or something or other. I don't know what it was, but then I just started bawling. I'm like, who are you people and where are you from? Like, what are you doing to me? And so that was kind of the big start of it. Like, so I think this is after Sherlock, after the Horse Expo. This might have even before the Mustang. Okay. But the next morning I went back to this clinic. I didn't want to go. Like, I can't go and face them. I just had my whole reality shattered. I'm like, I can't go face these people. But you were talking about eye gazing, and that the next morning I woke up and I was talking to one of those British girls. And while I was talking to her, I realized I am looking deep into your eyes while I'm talking to you. And then we kind of had this moment of silence while I was looking at it. We were just looking at each other's eyes, and I'm like, this feels more intimate than sex. And so I couldn't do it. It's like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this with my wife. Like, this. I felt like I was being unfaithful by that little thing happening right there. But I don't know. At that time, I realized I don't think I've ever held people's gaze like that. So, it's been a long unraveling, but it's been a short unraveling because I basically viewed the world the same way till I was 50, and I'm 57 now. Whereas, at that Horse Expo in Australia, I had a mother and a daughter come up to the booth, and the daughter says, I listen to your podcast. I love it. And I'm like, how old are you? And she says, I'm 15. And I'm thinking, oh my God.
Right.
Like, what an impact she might have on the world if they're viewing the world that way at 15.
Yeah, that's a conversation that Tom and I have pretty regularly, is like, when we were kids, the way that we handled cattle was so different than the way that we communicate with them now. And like, I remember when I was a kid, specifically one time, my dad and my uncle and my cousins and I grew up on a feedlot. We were bringing cattle into the pins so that we could give them vaccinations. And my dad says, Taryn, you got to holler at them because that's how they know you're back here. And I was like, in my body, I felt that that wasn't right. But who am I to say to my dad, who knows more than me, no? So I didn't tell him no, but I also didn't start hollering at the cattle. And so we talk about this, like how much better our kids are set up should they choose to go into ranching than we were set up. Like they're so much farther ahead than us.
Yeah, but this is something about cattle. They're set up to interact with any sentient being in a different way. And you would know this, that you create your own reality, and how you interact with cattle, horses, dogs, and humans will be reflected back to you. You know, you create that.
Yeah, something that has been baffling me recently and for a long time, is how there are people who I know personally, some people that I look up to, that are so good at communicating with either cattle or horses, but it doesn't translate to humans. That's kind of the basis of this podcast. But I mean, and I have said in one of my workshops, if we communicated with our cattle the same way that we communicate with humans, we would be out of business.
But don't you feel like a lot of times people do communicate with cattle or horses, because we're kind of both in those areas, the same way they do with people. And sometimes they learn to communicate with people different, and then it carries over into the horses or the cattle. Or sometimes you learn to communicate with the horses or the cattle different, and it carries over to the humans. Because I don't think you can make that change in one place and not have affect the other place.
Yeah, that's true. I think there's some overlap there. The one thing that gets brought up a lot within the ranching community is sword alley screaming matches, because there's so much confusion. And the person that's doing the sorting and maybe the screaming, if they go out and move those cows by themselves with no other humans around, they communicate so well. But when they add another human in, they're not.
Especially if it's a human that you have baggage with. Like, you know, you've all seen the T-shirt that says, I'm sorry for what I said while we were working cattle, you know, like husbands and wives. Or think about this, back when we were showing in the reining, sometimes at big shows, I would get other horse trainers to get my wife ready to show, because they would say something to her, which would be exactly the same thing I would say. But when I say it, there's 25 years of baggage attached to it. When they say it, it just is the words. It's not, there's no other stuff there. And I think husbands and wives working cattle together is probably the same thing. He says the thing, and she hears all the other things he said over the last 20 years in that advice, and it doesn't land the same, don't you think?
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems, at least from my personal experience and observation, that it's sometimes a lot easier for us to extend grace to our horses and cattle and dogs than it is to extend grace to our fellow humans, whether or not we have the baggage. Definitely harder if we do have the baggage, but also whether or not.
Yeah, well, we have human bags. You know, it can be the same with horses too. Like some trainers, and I imagine at some point in time it's affected me too, is it's much easier to work with someone else's horse than your own. Because someone else's horse, you're in the moment working with what's there, because you don't have any history, whereas your own, there's a lot of history there, and you might not approach it the same way as you would approach it if you didn't know anything about the horse.
Yeah. We just recently purchased a 5-year-old gelding who was the full brother to this amazing little filly that we had. And he's unstarted. And so I've read your book, I've watched your YouTube, all these things. Like, I'm really going to make him feel felt, right? And I think I have. Like, he's changed a lot and he feels more comfortable. He's definitely, I can see that he feels safer. But I go to get on him for the first time a few weeks ago, and I do all the things to prepare him for that. And I get on and I'm sitting up there, and he disengages his hind end when I had asked him to bring his head around. He disengages his hind end to the left. And I'm like, oh, that's so cool. Good job. I'm rubbing him. I'm making him feel the love. And then I ask him to bring his head around to the right, which he does. And I'm like, well, since you did it on the left, you can surely do it if I ask you to the right. And I asked him, and I missed his cue that he was not ready for that. And he goes up in the air. And I was not in that moment. I was like, not scared, nothing. Like I was pretty calm, but I let go of the lead rope. I kicked my feet out of the stirrups and off the back I went. And I bruised my leg pretty good. And I think I hit it on the horn. I don't know, but it had a nice bruise there. And then as soon as I'm off, he goes over and stands not in the corner because we're in the round pen, but he goes and stands by the fence. And I go over there and I let him know, like, hey, dude, I'm sorry. That was my bad. We go back to the beginning. I start and I get back on him. And then I notice as I'm riding other horses later on that I have this burning in my neck. Like when I'm on the horse for a little while and I'm like, what is going on? Because it wasn't like muscle pain or pain in like my spine. It was just a burning in my skin. And so I got curious about that and started asking myself, what is happening here? And I ultimately came to, I had lost some confidence. Like I can't support my horses. Even the ones that have been riding for a long time, like I can't support them. I don't know what I'm doing. And just figuring that out has helped. I mean, I don't have the neck pain anymore, but I also haven't been back on that horse. We've just gone back to hanging out with each other because I'd watched another one of your YouTube videos and I was really paying attention to how the horse was responding to you. And I was like, I still kind of think that he is reverting inward a little bit. So we've gone backwards a little.
Had you had him come up beside you on the fence on both sides?
Mm-hmm.
And he was good on that right side?
Mm-hmm.
Something I do, especially when I first ride him, but and this is not communicating your awareness as in a timing issue. And think about this, and you may have already done this, but when you get on him, like when you first get on him, just be really aware of his breathing. And what I like to do is sit there until they'll lick and chew. It might be 10 minutes. And I wouldn't be fussing around for 10 minutes and patting and rubbing and scratching. And I would just sit there. And I got a mare I started a few years ago that was she's an Andalusian and she's really, really feely and can kind of go from really frantic, worried to shut down really quite easily. Like she can go to both quite easily. So I spent a lot of time with her on the ground. But when I first rode, well, I'll tell you what, getting her ready to ride, I sit on him off the fence. It took me 8 days of just working on that to get to where she was really good at me sitting off the fence. But the first time I got on her, I sat there and I think it was 7.5, because we videoed it, 7.5 minutes before she went and had a big old lick and a chew. And then the first ride was really good. And back in the day, I used to be got to walk, trot, canter both directions first ride. I'm no longer that way. And it wasn't until, I think it was the third, maybe the fourth ride, I actually asked her to trot. And I've got pictures of her trotting around on that first time she's ever trotted, and her ears are about wither height and her legs are swinging like she's not trotting along tight. She's swinging her legs. She looks like a really well-educated horse. And then I think it was the fifth ride, I cantered her for the first time. Same thing. She stretched her neck down. Her ears are about wither height. Her hind legs way up underneath her. She looks like a well-trained horse. The first time she'd ever cantered. And that was the first time I'd ever sat on one when I first got on them and waited for them to have a big breath and lick and chew before I did anything. And then when I started doing things, I think I waited for those in between each ask too. And so I think, if he was good on that one side, but then he seemed good on the other side, and then you asked, and then he blew up, he may have been just holding his breath that whole time. So he may have been, they're so good at appearing to be good and not quite being good. So yeah, I don't know if that's helpful, but.
No, that is very helpful.
And something I do on the ground, that mare was especially like that, but every time I ask them to do something and then I stop asking them to do something, I wait for them to have a big breath and lick and chew before I ask it again, even in the teasing stage. So, I might spend most of the session waiting. more of the session waiting than actually doing something. But you get to where you ask them to do something, and as soon as you stop asking to do it, you're done with that. Like they let go of that. They're not holding any tension from the thing that just happened. And yeah, the analogy I use, like at clinics, I say, think about the nervous system of any prey animal. Let's say it's a gazelle in Africa or whatever. Well, let's say they're horses, So the herd of horses, they're out there grazing, they're in the parasympathetic nervous system, and a saber-toothed tiger shows up and chases them, and they outrun the tiger. So they run, they outrun the saber-toothed tiger, and then, they're standing still there. Wow, that was wild. Have a big old lick and chew, then they go back to grazing. That's how, and then 3 days later, another one, saber-toothed tiger shows up. That's how the nervous system's supposed to work. But what if saber-toothed tiger shows up, they outrun the saber-toothed tiger, he goes away, and as their breathing's slowing down and they're coming back down, right before they lick and chew and go back to grazing, right before another saber-toothed tiger shows up, and they got to run again. And then they outrun that one, and their nervous system starts to come back down. But right before it's a rock bottom, it goes again. They will eventually get to where they don't go all the way down. They get almost all the way down, and they get stuck there. And I think that's what happens when we're like training horses and interacting with them. We ask for something and they do it, and we don't wait for them to completely let go of what just happened before we ask again. And then we don't let complete go of that before we ask again. And they can get stuck in low-level sympathetic nervous system, even though they'll come back to being standing still every time or whatever, but they're just kind of still not completely relaxed. And that's something I'm really big on these days. And I did do that with that mare a lot, because she would kind of hold her breath a lot. She's one who could appear quite good, but she's not quite good. And it was just, I think that combined with all the training I was doing probably made a big difference, I think.
It's like fear isn't meant to be a long-term fuel. Or, when you don't let them come down, you're essentially, I'm saying fear, but just that heightened sense of awareness.
Right. Yeah. I started out one of my demos in Australia the other day, and the demo was a nervous system regulation. And I said, nervous system regulation is not about being calm all the time. It's about having your nervous system have a direct correlation to the situation you're in. There is a time to be in fight or flight. There's a time to be freeze. But in the wild, horses don't hang on to those nervous system states. They're there for a reason. If you go into freeze mode, it's for a reason. But then when the moment's passed, it's time to go back into parasympathetic nervous system. Most animals do not spend time in stuck emotional states. And a lot of times the way we handle them, we get them stuck in certain type of emotional states. And then you have problems with them because they are stuck in those emotional states, not because you're not a good trainer or the training doesn't work.
Right. We can do that with our horses. And we do it with each other as humans. We get ourselves stuck in emotional states. This has been a long time coming, but I'm just still so fascinated between the parallels between species. And it just, I think, speaks to the fact that we're all connected. Everything's connected.
Can I read you a quote?
Yes.
And the quote is, "The only actions that do not cause opposing reactions are those that are aimed at the good of all. They're inclusive, not exclusive. They join, they don't separate. They are not for my country, but for all of humanity. They are not for my religion, but the emergence of consciousness in all human beings. Not for my species, but for all sentient beings and all of nature."
Ooh, I really like that.
I was right the other day, I'm going to take a screenshot of that. And then the other one that is somewhat along those lines, as I just read it to someone this morning. The other one was by the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. The next Buddha will not take the form of a person. The next Buddha will rather take the shape of a community that practices understanding and loving kindness, a community that practices a way of conscious living. This may be the most important thing for Earth's survival. And I feel like the message that you are spreading to the people in your neck of the woods or your sphere of influence, that's what you're doing with your podcast. That's what I'm trying to do with my podcast. Really, underneath all of the stuff, I feel that's the benefit of the message that we're trying to share.
Yeah.
But being in the moment, not thinking I'm saving the world and preaching it from the top of the treetops. Just you go about, you do what you're doing in the way that you're doing it, and those sorts of things will be the outcome. So what's the bumper sticker? I think globally, but act locally.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. It's amazing. You and I are on the same journey, but you're on some profound stuff. I love it.
I think I heard on your podcast that you've read Gabor Mate.
Love Gabor Mate.
Yeah. So I, went on a binge and listened or read all of his books, every book that he's written earlier this year. Actually, I started last year, but I finished him up this year. And the one thing I walked away from reading his work is that, and I think this comes out in your work too, or at least I pick up on it from your work. Attachment and attunement are what humans need most. And at the same time, what humans are most lacking. And have you seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding?
You know what? I don't think I have. Must be some good lines in that, because people always have a line from Big Fat Greek Wedding.
Yeah. So Gus, the patriarch in the family, he's like, you give me any word and I show you how that word has a Greek root. And I'm kind of the mind that you give me any issue that we face in the world today, whether it's with our animals, other humans, illness, whatever it is, and I can show you how the root of that is somewhere in attachment and attunement.
The root of it's disconnection.
Yeah. Insecure attachment.
You said illness disease is dis-ease in the body. And that dis-ease would be it might be a story you're telling yourself. It might be that you're not at ease with yourself,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool stuff.
Yeah. It's great. Well, I won't keep you any longer, but before we go, will you tell everyone where they can find you if they would like to follow along?
So social media, my Facebook wall, my personal wall is just Warwick Schiller. I don't post that much stuff on there. Warwick Schiller Attuned Horsemanship is a page I have on Facebook. It's just Warwick Schiller on Instagram. I have lots of stuff on there. YouTube channel is just Warwick Schiller. And then my website is warwickschiller.com. And my podcast is the Journey On podcast.
And your website is where you can find the library, correct?
Yeah. So my main business is I have an online video library that I've been putting videos on for about 10 years now. I've got 800 and something videos on there. And that's videos.warwickschiller.com.
Very good. Well, thank you again so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really excited for it to come out.
I'm excited that there's a you in the world. How old are you?
40.
Yeah, you got a head start on it. You look a lot younger than 40, by the way, but
oh, thank you.
Got a head start on it. And I'm just excited that someone else is spreading this message in a different place than I am. I had someone the other day say, are you ever going to get Brene Brown on your podcast? I'm like, I don't need to get Brene Brown on my podcast because everything she has to share has already been shared. Everybody knows who she is. I had a guy named, you ever heard of Peter Crone?
I have not.
Oh, well, here we go. I had a guy named Peter Crone on the podcast recently, and he's as profound as Brene Brown, but it seems like he's, in certain spheres, he's a big deal, but not a lot of horse people seem to have heard of him. So I got him, and I didn't think I could get him on the podcast because he's a big deal, but apparently our stats are enough to where he came on. And I was glad to have him on there because that would have introduced a whole lot of new people to Peter Crone. Brene Brown, I don't feel like I could introduce new people to Brene Brown because I've talked about her so much that anybody that follows me already knows who she is. So, it's not about having the most famous person on your podcast, but trying to have someone with a message people may not have heard. And in your business, I think there may be people who haven't heard the message that you're trying to share, and that excites me.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a hard path because we've been so, again, going back to Gabor Mate, he's like, just because it's normal doesn't mean it's natural. And so we can take the quo and make sure it's not status for long. And that's what I'm hoping is coming from this. I want to take the status and make sure it's not quo for much longer.
I think there's a change coming. So I just came back from that horse expo in Australia, and, it's Australia. So, they're big on the English disciplines. And normally at this horse expo, they have a a dressage superstar from somewhere in Europe comes over and he teaches this dressage masterclass or whatever. So there's a friend of mine who I've had on the podcast named Will Rogers, who trains dressage horses he's Australian, but he trains dressage horses in Germany. But he looks at it completely different. He talks about it in an emotional and an energetic and a spiritual way. And he came to that horse expo and there's all these dressage people who show up to see the dressage guy. And he sent them a message they might not have heard before. And there were several other presenters at this horse expo doing the same thing. And usually it's like how to kick and pull sort of thing. And it was just the whole vibe of the whole horse expo I felt was completely different this year. And there's nothing I've ever experienced before. So there is hope. I think there's changes in the air.
That's exciting. And now I kind of wish that I had been there.
It was super cool.
All right. Well, thank you again for coming on. And, maybe we'll have you back in the future if you're willing.
Definitely willing to talk to you. I could talk to you for hours.
I feel the same. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so grateful for you. If you found value in this episode, I'd love for you to share with others who might also benefit from tuning in. Share by word of mouth, send it in a text, take a screenshot and post it on social media, or share however you prefer. And if you haven't already, hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Until next time, draw good movement.